Everyone, this is our last Zoom presentation, and my last one went a little longer than I wanted, so this one I'm going to really watch the clock and end it earlier. I think 38 minutes was the last one. It was only supposed to be 30, so this one's going to be 22, and I'm going to follow through with that. So let's start right away, share the screen, not take any more of your time than I need to, and here we go. This is The Quest for the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer. I start off with a picture of this. Let me just explain why. Albert Schweitzer was a philosopher and writer and thinker back in the 1920s and 30s. He wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus that really started off this whole academic approach to really distinguish the difference between what's called the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history. And you think, well, what's the difference? The Christ of faith is the believer's account. Nothing wrong with that, truly to be honored and valued and studied in any class. But the quest for the historical Jesus, or the Christ of, the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history, is now, we can't just assume blindly that the stories that are told are absolutely 100% accurately historical, because it doesn't do probably fair credit to understanding who Jesus is. We really want to dive deeper and understand it truly with a greater sense of historical accuracy than just saying, oh, he was born in Bethlehem, he died, he rose from the dead, and that's all we need to know. The scholars want to ask questions like, well, did he exist? Who was his family? What was his language? What was his job? How did he die? What caused his death? What did he teach? All that stuff that we really, because he is such an interesting character, all that stuff that we really should ask, all that stuff that makes Jesus seem even more likable in many ways. So I don't know if that makes sense, but sometimes students tell me that having studied through their life the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith, they really like the Jesus of history. He comes off as a remarkable, amazing moral philosophical character. So here we go. So let us start here. I explained the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history concept just now. I explained that that quest started about 100 years ago. But we have a lot of very famous biblical scholars today. I mentioned one here is John Dominic Crossan, or I just put his name here as Crossan, and he's one that will garner a lot of our insights about Jesus from his research. He wrote a book called Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. He himself was a Catholic priest who turned biblical scholar, and we find that the case in a lot of our academic scholars that we'll be looking at. Bart Ehrman is another example of somebody who went to was raised in a very conservative Christian background, was a fundamentalist Christian turned biblical scholar. We find that with Karen Armstrong. She herself was a Catholic nun turned biblical scholar. And what I think is that's happening is here they are very deeply religious vocationally, but then as they study the material at a much deeper, richer level, they move away from just approaching it religiously and really study it academically. And that makes sense in light of the fact that it consumes so much of their life that they move in the direction of the academic as well. And sometimes in replace of, like for instance, Karen Armstrong, even though I think of her as a religious woman, is not the Catholic nun anymore. Okay. I really don't know her religious background per se, but she speaks so positively of all the world religions. Now let's pull some ideas from Crossan on the biography of Jesus and ask the first question, did Jesus exist? And there is enough research to indicate, this seems like a scandalous question for some of you, but there is enough research to say, yes, we have great confidence in the existence of Jesus. And that should give a lot of people a feeling of contentment to hear that versus, oh my gosh, how dare you challenge the existence of Jesus? We can say outside of the New Testament, there is evidence that Jesus existed. Now, what evidence do we have? Well, we have writings that are non-Christian writings, and that's a good source to begin with. We have writings from the Jewish historian Josephus. We have writings from some, which was a couple decades after the life of Jesus, but close enough. Again, very close enough. Unlike the Buddha, we have to go, more centuries to have evidence of the existence of Buddha. We do feel confident that Buddha existed, but it's more centuries. Where in the life of Jesus, it's more decades. We do have some writings from Roman historians as well, much later than Josephus, but certainly pointing in the direction of the existence of a remarkable character named not Jesus, but Yeshua. That was the next thing I wanted to talk about, was the name of Jesus. It would be, the Hebrew name would be Yeshua, more like Joshua, but been translated into English as Jesus. And the dates of Jesus, we also more or less know. You're not going to talk about, well, he was born in the year 0, because that's not correct. You're going to be talking about 4 to 6 BCE. And the reason why academic scholars come up with that date is because they feel very confident that he was born around the end days of Herod the Great, and because there's several sources that mention that, and Herod the Great died, and the time period between his death years were 4 to 6 BCE. I mentioned that we feel confident, and what I mean by we, I mean, I'm like an academic, but I'm not a biblical scholar per se, but scholars in general feel confident. And what are they utilizing to get that level of confidence? They want to use a few sources. Number one, they don't just want to use the Christian sources. It's okay to use Christian sources, absolutely. But you want to also, if you can, use outside sources to add even greater credibility to the claim historically. So you want to use Jewish sources, Roman sources, some cases we talked about Egyptian sources when we're talking about Moses. So outside sources. Number two, if you are going to use Christian sources, you don't just have to use the canonical sources. You can use other gospels, other materials. Any of them are potentially fair game to utilize, not just ones that made it into the New Testament. Another thing you want to do, to the best of your ability, is use sources that are earlier in its tradition than later. So if you can go furthest back to the life of the Jesus, the better. And so earlier gospels might serve a little more insightful than much later gospels that are farther removed. And another thing, this is very essential, is that it's important to use sources that have more than one source. Like you have 2 independent accounts pointing to that story. And when you have that, it's much more confidence that a scholar can have in that claim. There is something to be said if you have a source. Now this may be complicated to add in a little quick introduction to this class, but the source of Mark is considered independent. The source of John could be considered independent, but Matthew and Luke are not considered independent. They're considered one source. And the reason why is they both pull from a source called what they call Q, because the stories have such similarities and the word choices, they feel from literary analysis that was really one source that they're pulling from, and they're both utilizing that source. So they themselves are considered not independent sources. So I just thought I'd throw that one in there. So in biblical scholarship, you are utilizing more than just the New Testament. You're using a plethora of information to garner your research. And in terms of the birth of Jesus, a lot of scholars say it's incorrect to say Bethlehem, and then how and why did the Bethlehem story develop? And again, I'm not absolutely claiming Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. It's just, as again, I've reiterated this before, the concept of a scholar is a detective, and a detective is trying to piece things together. It's like a mystery puzzle, and the best of our ability to do that. And so why do scholars kind of call into question the Bethlehem story is because Jesus is referred to as Jesus as Nazareth, and that's usually the land of which is your birth. You would say, for instance, I was born, I don't remember where I was born, Mission Hills, Andrea of Mission Hills, or my children were born in Laguna Beach, so-and-so of Laguna Beach. So Jesus of Nazareth would be his birthplace. Bethlehem may have been a story that gets added on, and the reason why, and again, this is biblical scholarship here, is because there's an account in the Hebrew scriptures saying that the Messiah would come from the land of David, which is Bethlehem, and so it's a way to connect him to that prophecy. So that may be something to consider. I think the prophecy was from Micah. So we talked about the birth. We have a story in the book of Matthew talking about how the family travels to Egypt, and Croissant in his revolutionary biography asked that question, did this family really travel to Egypt? And he argues that there's really kind of a way, an attempt to connect Jesus to the Moses story. If you remember in your Hebrew scriptures, there's a story about Moses, and Moses as a little baby was put into the River Nile, and because the Pharaoh at the time was killing all the firstborn males, and he was protected and raised as in the Pharaoh's family. When he was found in the river, my phone is buzzing, I'm just going to ignore all that. So what Croissant is saying is, here we have this story about Moses. We have somebody trying to kill the firstborn males, and isn't it coincidental that the Herod story is the same thing? In the New Testament, there's a story about Herod the Great at the time of Jesus also trying to kill the firstborn males. And so Croissant's, and it's only really found in the book of Matthew, is to my understanding, where that's where it's really articulated. And so Croissant is saying, as a biblical scholar that he is, that it's too coincidental. There probably is some kind of overlapping of these stories, and it's a way to say kind of Jesus is the new Moses for us, the new Moses of our day. Just like Moses was in Egypt, just like Moses was pursued as an infant to be killed, so was Jesus. And then the John cousin story appears in the book of Luke, to my understanding, and it's really kind of placing Jesus above John. There's a kind of a interesting relationship between John and Jesus that's described by biblical scholars. And it's argued that, and this is quite, I mean, to me, quite interesting, is that when Jesus was baptized by John, that's quite a significant event, because biblical scholars are saying it's kind of pointing in the direction that Jesus was a disciple of John. Now, a Christian conservative perspective might challenge that, but from an academic one, that the fact that that story is there and it doesn't serve any, I don't know what the word is, but it doesn't make Christianity look any better that it's there, but they still include it. Seems to be some kind of historical accuracy to that account, that Jesus was in fact part of the John movement, and that Croissant argues that Jesus ends up rejecting John the Baptist philosophy and his whole religious organization and teaching something quite different than John. Now, what did John teach? Let me just, since I'm on John, I'll cover that and then I'll go to the next material. John, it said, argued for kind of the end of the world philosophy, the apocalypse is coming, repent, get ready for it, you know, the day of judgment's coming, all of that kind of concept. And John was articulating that, and Jesus being kind of caught in that philosophy for a while, but ends up rejecting it and saying it's the kingdom of God is not an apocalyptic moment. It's, this is Croissant talking. This is this particular interpretation. A lot of scholars agree with it, that the end of the world is not the focus. It's the here and the now and how we treat each other. So the message in the philosophy of Jesus that comes out attributed to Jesus is one of, you know, a philosophy quite different than John, not one of repent and prepare for the end, but one of love, care, and nurture the now and the people in the now. So, okay, that was a little mouthful there. So here we go. The parents of Jesus, we know his mother was Mary. Who his father was is a little bit of a question mark, because the academic perspective and the believers will vary. A lot of people say, of course, his father is God. But again, that's you're stepping in the shoes of the believer, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But if you're stepping out of that and playing the role of the academic, you're going to ask a fair question. If Joseph is portrayed not as his father, just like it doesn't serve any purpose to keep it in there unless there's some validity to the story, like in John baptizing Jesus, it's there, even though, you know, it works against it in some ways. Here we have the story of Joseph not being his father, and that's quite amazing that that account is in there, because it calls into the question, you know, it makes us ask that question, who is the father? The whole virgin account, it's argued that in the Old Testament, which you can use if you're a Christian, if you're Jewish, you would say Hebrew scriptures, there's a prophecy from, I think, the prophet Isaiah, that the mother of the Messiah will be an Alma, which is a woman who's a virgin at the her wedding night, that she is not consummated in any way her relationship yet, and she is a virgin at the time of marriage. So that virgin account gets attributed to Jesus, and then here we have the understanding of Mary as a virgin for her whole life, if you're following into the Catholic tradition. So the virginity idea is in the Hebrew scriptures, gets carried into the New Testament, but a lot of biblical scholars meant that the mother of the Messiah was to be a virgin up into the wedding, not for the rest of her life. So that may be an explanation of why we hear so much about virginity there, because of the prophecy of it. Again, this is kind of a challenging lesson plan for me, because I know a lot of you may have this tradition or not used to an academic study or a biography of Jesus. So I'm not claiming any of these are true. I'm just claiming we speculate his birthplace is not Bethlehem, but Nazareth. We speculate that he did not go to Egypt. Maybe he did. I don't know. We question who the father is, because we don't know if you're coming in from a non-religious perspective. His family, we're a little bit more confident on, because it actually mentions in several sources that he has 4 brothers and names those sources as James, Joseph, or Jose, Judas or Jude, and Simon. Again, the spelling and translations are a little different. And it also mentions he has 2 unnamed sisters, and we don't know. So that would be a family of 7. Okay, we know his family background was Jewish. We know his language was Aramaic. We know his career was a tekton. Sometimes that gets translated as a carpenter. It literally means somebody who works with their hands. We don't know specifically if he worked with wood, but a lot of people speculate with stone. So a stone cutter, carver, something like that. We know that he fit in the artisan class, which was one of the lower subsistence wage classes where it was very, very poor, a class in society that was usually considered uneducated and illiterate. That's quite important to know. A lot of our religious founders, like Muhammad, was illiterate. So when we look at, meaning that they didn't read and write. So that's not something that's any way a mark against anybody. It's the time period. And the artisan class would be one of struggle and hardship because it is very impoverished. And we talk about the 12 disciples of Jesus, and there's a mentioning in the New Testament that he had 12 disciples. The 12 disciples, again, he might have easily had that. Again, it's a question mark. I'm in no way saying he didn't have 12, but Croissant raises the question only that there's 12 tribes of Israel, and maybe the 12 is more of a symbolic number, but not literally 12, maybe connecting back to the 12 tribes of Israel. There's a lot of connections with the life of Jesus with the Hebrew scriptures, and a lot of parallels and trying to draw stories in from the Hebrew scriptures into the New Testament. The miracle accounts, if you're not a believer, can you interpret them in a more human way? And Croissant does. He looks at the account of Jesus healing, for instance, leprosy, and says the word leprosy gets mistranslated. It's not leprosy. The word lepra really translates as a skin ailment, and it could be eczema, it could be psoriasis, it could be, something that causes people of concern when they see your skin and they end up ostracizing you, thinking of you as diseased. And what Jesus came in and healed was not so much the loss of limbs, but what Jesus came in is healed the social stigma and the ostracization of that person, and really incorporated them in to the fold and welcomed them and loved them. So it's really a beautiful message if you interpret it in that sense. And the Barabbas story, again, I'm whipping you through, I'm trying to meet my clock here. So the word Barabbas means the son of the father. And there is a story in the New Testament of Pontius Pilate putting before the people, should I persecute Jesus or should I persecute Barabbas? And it gets being told by some scholars saying the word Barabbas means son of the father. So maybe the story could be understood as Pontius Pilate saying, should I persecute him as claiming a religious title, or should I persecute him as like a political insurrectionist? Which one should I persecute? I'm sorry, I keep saying the wrong word. And which one should I let go? And the people shout, let go the Barabbas claim, and persecute him for that, because one was punishable by death and one was not. So that's a different twist to look at the story. The age of Jesus, we know he died during the Pontius Pilate reign, and Pontius Pilate was in power at this time. So this is probably the age of Jesus's death is between 26 and 33. And Pontius Pilate supposedly was a horrible, horrible, brutal dictator. And the count of him saying, I wash my hands. Sadly, Croissant thinks that was a complete historical inaccuracy, that he kind of reveled on his brutality, and he most likely did not do that. And the fact that it's portrayed as the Romans were kind of innocent, it was really the Jewish people responsible, Croissant thinks is horrific because it led to the anti-Semitism from that time period up until today. And claiming Jews as responsible for the death of Jesus is inaccurate. He says truly it was the Romans, and more specifically Pontius Pilate. Croissant does think that Jesus's death account as portrayed in the New Testament, where he goes into the temple and overthrows the money changing tables at the time of Passover, when it was a tinderbox for any little spark can set off a horrific repercussion. He thinks that was accurate. There's enough evidence to point that Jesus, when he did that, led to his arrest and then led to his death sentence. And possibly Jesus was pursued by the Romans as a zealot, and the zealot were, right down here, I have it here, were Jews that were trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. Not in any way am I claiming Jesus was a zealot. Some biblical scholars do, like Reza Aslan, particularly Croissant doesn't really jive with that kind of concept, but he thinks that he was perceived as one because he came from Galilee, which is the home of the zealots. And then let's just go down here. So what does Croissant, this biblical scholar Croissant, argue is the teachings of Jesus? So I just kind of gave you some biography. He finds the teachings of Jesus extremely admirable, extremely commendable, that Jesus taught a message of open commensality and radical egalitarianism. And what that meant was open commensality was everybody was welcome to break bread together, to share meals together, that at the time of Jesus, that was unacceptable. It was a class society. It was the haves and the have-nots, and you were not allowed to interact with people of your different social status, and that Jesus was tearing down that social stratification and arguing for open commensality and that breaking of the bread together. And that Last Supper concept was this whole brethren pulled together and sharing a meal together, and interacting with, tax collectors and prostitutes and all of that just speaks so well of Jesus, that he was willing to tear down those divisions and reach out to people that are usually viewed quite negatively in society. And radical egalitarianism was the message of there shouldn't be the haves and the have-nots. As I said, Jesus was part of possibly of the artisan class, which was very poor subsistence wages at the illiterate level, and that he was challenging that and saying we should argue for a society where it's based on equality, it's based on love, it's based on compassion, it's based on openness, and all the things that we need in our society today. So the philosophy of Jesus, he comes off as an extremely deep moral philosopher. He comes off with extremely just such an admirable character that many people, even though they come from a Christian background, hear Croissant's message about what Jesus taught and really connect with it and think of him. It's kind of refreshing to say, oh, it's not, maybe we're dismissing his birthplace, but the message that he's teaching is so remarkable and so uplifting and so empowering to all of us today, and a message that is so relevant for all of us today. And so a lot of people really connect with that. Again, there's so much we don't know of the life of Jesus, the biography. These are just academic kind of, if I want to use the word guesses, that's fine, grounded in some academic sources, but nonetheless approaching it from a different perspective than a believer's perspective. Now, questions about the historical Jesus, just give you again some more information here, as I did in the last lesson plan, more paragraph form. The quest for the historical Jesus has been part of biblical scholarship for, it goes back really to the 18th century, but it's really in the 19th century that with Albert Schweitzer's quest for the historical Jesus that really took hold there. And then we have Croissant, and here's a picture of Croissant. And again, raised Catholic, raised as a Catholic priest, but really studies it academically today. And he's part of a seminar called the Jesus Seminar, where they investigate all of this material academically. And he argues that Jesus was part of kind of a Cynic movement at that time. And what a Cynic's, here it is, what is a Cynic? A Cynic is not somebody who, use the word today, maybe somebody who doesn't believe anything, but Cynic didn't mean that. It was actually a philosophical school of thought that challenged materialism and challenged, all the wants and the needs of the world, leading to pain and suffering, kind of a Buddhist message, and that you're kind of happier if you're content with what you have. And it's almost like a counterculture movement at the time, and that Jesus was a remarkable philosopher because he was part of that and really argued for us to change our way of thinking and our approach to the world. And that Paul's the one that really established it, as I already mentioned this prior in another lesson plan, as a distinct non-Jewish movement, church councils I talked about. So a lot of that, some of these are actually pulling from the last lesson plan. So don't really worry about that. It's more this material here, the biography of Jesus, but I like mostly of all of them, the philosophy of Jesus. And again, with all the stuff going on in the world today, this is a very important message for us to hear. So hopefully I gave you in 20 minutes, I did it in 20 minutes, introduction to the life of Jesus from a biblical scholarship perspective, from a believer's perspective. He was, as we all know, go back to the Nicene Creed. He comes from the Nicene believer's perspective. He comes from the Father as the Son of God. He was always in existence. And all of that believer's perspective is truly to be understood and valued, but we also need to understand the academic, and the academic I think is refreshing because it gives us a different take. And this whole class, as you remember, is a nikon devata, multiple perspectives. They're all welcome. It's all part of our learning experience. So that was my little preachy message to everybody. Thank you for listening. I end my Zooms. Namaste. Yay, the semester. I'm done. Thank you. Yay. Time for a glass of wine. Just kidding.